Welcome to Interpolated, a podcast where we explore the history, the music, and the humans behind one of New York's biggest rock bands, Interpol. I'm your host, Seth Griffin, basement music producer, founder of the Interpol tribute band Extrapol, and self-proclaimed Interpol connoisseur. In this episode, we're taking a deep dive into Interpol's origins, their formation, their earliest recordings, and the road that led them to their groundbreaking debut album. This is episode 1, Before the Bright Lights. The year is 1997. You're a student at NYU, living in the heart of New York City, but everything feels a bit smaller, a bit simpler, before the city and the world would change forever in 2001. You still have a landline phone. There's no Facebook, no TikTok, not even MySpace. Your connection to the world is more immediate and tangible. Even Manhattan feels intimate, more like a neighborhood than the sprawling, interconnected global hub it would become. The music around you is as fractured as the city itself. On the radio, it's the golden age of hip-hop. Jay-Z, Nas, and the ghost of Biggie, whose recent death turned his voice into an anthem of New York morning. Meanwhile, MTV is cranking out pop idols in crop tops and low-rise jeans, prepackaged for mass appeal. Rock, to many, feels like it's lost its way. Grunge had burned out with Kurt Cobain, and what remained was a watered-down echo. Post-grunge and nu metal, clogging the airways with bands like Limp Bizkit, Creed, and Puddle of Mud. Alternative wasn't rebellious anymore. It was a radio format. If there's one thing you can safely assume about a young Daniel Kessler, it's that he probably wasn't tuned in to whatever was playing on mainstream radio. Fitting in wasn't really his style. Born in London and raised in France until the age of 11, Kessler carried with him a quiet sophistication and a worldview that set him apart from most of his American peers. His musical tastes were wide-ranging, stretching from hardcore to classical, always chasing a certain emotional depth rather than genre loyalty. At the time, he was already embedded in the industry, working for indie labels like Jet Set and running the US arm of the British label Domino, literally out of his New York apartment. That gave him a front-row seat to the rise and fall of countless underground acts. He understood the gears of the business, the strategies that worked and the ones that didn't. So when it came time for Daniel to step into the spotlight himself, he was fully prepared to forge his path to success. In 1997, the moment finally arrived when Daniel was ready to find musicians to join him. Not the garage band type, not jam session bros, people with taste, with restraint, with a sense of mood. But that kind of person wasn't easy to find, so he started small. He began jamming with a dorm mate, Greg Drudy, who had just started playing drums. Daniel himself admitted that their first sessions were very loose and bad, but that he was just happy to have someone to play with. Not too long after, Carlos Dengler entered the picture. He was a New York native, born to a Colombian mother and German father. Studying philosophy and history at the time, he wanted to pursue a career in academia. Daniel noticed him first in class, dressed all in black with sharp features, and thought he was the kind of guy who just looked like he had good taste in music, so he approached him. It turned out that his instincts were spot on. Carlos had once played guitar, but had put it aside. Undeterred, Daniel handed him a bass and invited him to a rehearsal. When asked about this encounter later, Carlos said, "Daniel convinced me to play with him, which I considered a landmark achievement, because nothing else could have been further from what I wanted to do." Carlos continues, "I showed up at Daniel's apartment one day when he was throwing a party. I was on my way to go out to a club that night, and I came in full neo-priest goth punk regalia, with a skirt and makeup. The poor guy was very confused. I'm sure he had been saying, 'I found this bass player, my band's actually gonna happen.' And then I show up, and everyone sees this quasi-drag queen. I definitely remember him going, "This is not how he looked when I found him in class." Despite his hesitation, there was an immediate musical connection at the rehearsal. Though raw and unpolished, there was an undeniable spark. Something was starting to fall into place. By the time Paul Banks entered the picture, the band had already been jamming for a few months. Like Kessler, Banks had experience beyond his years. He grew up in 4 different countries: England, where he was born, the US, Spain, and Mexico. Daniel had known Paul from a summer program in Paris, and though they didn't have a strong relationship at the time, Daniel immediately recognized Paul's potential as a bandmate. For an 18-year-old, Paul had an air that he belonged in a world all his own, Daniel recalled. He wasn't intimidated by anything, and he had a strong curiosity for life. Initially, Paul Banks wasn't looking to join a band. He had been focused on writing and performing his own material as a solo artist. However, when Daniel approached him about joining Interpol, he agreed to attend a rehearsal. At first, Paul was reserved. He didn't sing right away, instead concentrating on playing his guitar. That all changed when they entered a small rehearsal space called Funkadelic. There, for the first time, Paul stepped up to the mic. As Daniel and Carlos later recalled, it was a pivotal moment. Paul started singing, and Carlos and I looked at each other, eyebrows raised. "It really was a moment I won't forget," Daniel said. So what about that distinctive vocal style? Here's what Paul had to say about it. "My vocal style was affected by New York City. When you get in an 11 by 10 room with a drummer, shouting becomes the MO." The connection was instant. Despite the clashing personalities between him and Carlos Dengler, the music resonated with Paul, and he ultimately joined the band, taking on both guitar and vocal duties. With Paul's distinctive voice now at the forefront, the band began to solidify its sound. What they still needed, however, was a name. In the early days, they played shows without one at all. But as their crowds grew, it became clear that they needed something for fans to remember and return to. One of the early contenders was Las Armas, which translates to the weapons, but it never really resonated. The band cycled through several forgettable names before finally settling on Interpol, a choice that reportedly came about after a friend mispronounced Paul Banks' name. Daniel described it as simple and fitting for their style. However, the name wasn't without its drawbacks. They soon found themselves receiving emails from people reporting stolen cars and other crimes, with Daniel often sheepishly responding, "Sorry for the confusion, we're just a rock band named Interpol." Even rock bands need great marketing. Luckily for you, our sponsor, Hootletter, can help you with yours. Hootletter turns your podcast episodes, YouTube videos, and blog posts into engaging email newsletters automatically. With a recurring newsletter, you can grow your audience, boost your engagement, and keep your fans coming back for more. And Hootletter doesn't just help you create content, it takes care of the entire process. From building and managing your email list with a custom subscription page to sending out your newsletters. Everything happens on one simple platform without adding to your already busy workload. It also makes it easy to include sponsored content, unlocking new revenue streams effortlessly. So if you're ready to grow your audience and get more out of your content, give Hootletter a try. It's completely free to get started. Visit hootletter.com today. During their early shows in 1998 and 1999, the band recorded 3 tracks that were self-released on what came to be known as the demo tape, featuring PDA, Roland, and Get the Girls. By the time they released Precipitate, a slightly more official, though still self-produced EP in 1999, the band had channeled their raw energy into a sharper, more captivating post-punk sound. The EP saw 2 separate releases, which makes the timeline a bit murky. The original 1999 pressing was limited to 500 CDs and featured pink lettering on a gray background. A later 2001 version was distinguished by white lettering. Precipitate included the title track, Song 7, a slower re-recording of PDA, and A Time to Be So Small, which featured Paul reading a passage from Literature and Evil by George Bataille over a large portion of the track. In the spring of 2000, Interpol experienced their first significant lineup change. After almost 3 years with the band, drummer Greg Drudy decided to move on to pursue other musical endeavors. While details about his departure remain sparse, it's clear he stayed active in the post-hardcore scene, going on to play with Hot Cross and founding the influential Level Plane Records. Interpol, however, wasn't the right fit for him at the time, and his departure opened the door for Sam Fogarino, who officially joined the band in May 2000, making his debut at the Mercury Lounge. Sam and Daniel had first crossed paths in 1998, when Sam was working at Beacon's Closet, a Brooklyn clothing store, where he also sold vinyl records. He would soon become a vital addition to Interpol, not just behind the drum kit, but as the only member with prior experience in both studio recording and engineering. His technical knowledge and steady presence would help shape the band's sound in the years to come. With their live shows gaining traction, their early demos being passed around, and thanks to the invaluable support of the Scottish-based Chemical Underground label, Interpol was able to release the somewhat explicitly titled Fucked ID No. 3 in December 2000, and embark on a small but significant UK tour in the spring of the following year. The label went above and beyond, providing essential gear, a van, and even booking some of the shows. This level of support proved pivotal, allowing the band to take their emerging sound beyond New York and make a lasting impact on audiences across the UK. Bigger even than the shows themselves was their invitation to record a session with legendary BBC radio figure John Peel. After being in the same space as iconic acts like Led Zeppelin and Bowie, the band was on cloud nine. Sam recalls, "It didn't get broadcast immediately, but we drove around town listening to John Peel anyway. And that was just a thrill in itself. To realize that a week later, he was going to be saying Interpol on the air. Those recordings got circulated to different labels, and that's when Matador caught on." The Peel sessions included 4 staples that would be re-recorded and released on the band's upcoming album: Hands Away, Obstacle 2, The New, and NYC. The Chemical Underground EP, limited to just 1,000 copies, featured the 3 songs from the demo tape, with Get the Girls retitled as 5, along with an additional track, Precipitate. Even in these very unrefined mixes, it's not hard to see why Interpol was turning heads when you listen to their early songs. Let's single out PDA for a moment. This was one of the first, if not the first, Interpol songs ever written by most accounts. To me, it does a great job encapsulating several of the things that Interpol does best. So let's take a brief listen, and then we'll break those down.
Yours is the only version of my desertion that I could ever subscribe to, and that is all that I can do. You are up past dinner.
One thing I won't do much in this series is analyze Paul Banks' lyrics. As a talented writer, Paul's lyrics are often purposefully vague, leaving interpretation up to the listener. I don't want to superimpose my own understanding of his lyrics on you, just as Paul tends to shy away from giving his own lyrical analysis. However, I will highlight lyrics where appropriate, and I'd like to highlight the opening line of PDA as an example of Paul's way with words. He sings, "Yours is the only version of my desertion that I could ever subscribe to. That is all that I can do." Off the bat, we're introduced to Interpol with a well-structured head-scratcher. I love this line because it takes a minute to work through it and understand what he actually means. The syntax is inverted, dense and formal, intentionally so. Instead of saying, I could only subscribe to your version of my desertion, it's reversed. And using a word like desertion, so emotionally loaded, it's an act of abandonment. It carries guilt. Whoever the parties involved in this story, there's clearly tension, which is mimicked by the pounding drums and similarly relentless, often dissonant guitars. That tension does find release, though, in a powerful climax of emotions, about 2/3 of the way through the song. The drums are cut, the bass stops, and we're left with a lone guitar strumming a single chord over and over. Let's take a listen. As a listener, emotionally, this feels like a rebirth. Alone, forging ahead on a new path. One by one, instruments enter and begin to rebuild what was lost. But we're not building it the same way we did before. Carlos plays the bass line higher up on the scale, feeling almost light, which is in stark contrast to the syncopated, thumping bass we've heard thus far in the song. When the second guitar enters, it's no longer dissonant and full of tension. It's optimistic and melodic. In its outro, PDA is, dare I say it, joyful. Overall, it's a masterclass of musical emotion that captures so well the complexity of our own human relationships. We're treated to a more experimental side of the band with the EP's next song, Precipitate. This song is meandering, to say the least, with quite a few tempo changes and melodies that can feel quite unrelated from each other. While I can see why it wasn't included on the final album, sorry, spoiler alert, it does have qualities that have given it a new life. We get yet another outro in Precipitate. This time, the song doesn't give us resolve. The uneasiness builds and remains. The next track, Roland, is another song that requires a brief discussion about the lyrics. In a recent interview on the Broken Record podcast, Paul discusses his writing process. He says, I think technically the term automatic writing comes from the surrealists. It has to do with sort of just like vomiting out thoughts. And I think trying to kind of stuff a straw into your subconscious and just get that stuff straight out. I mean, in the early days, I found most lyrics and most music to be kind of phony. Like it's about trying to package the experiences of life into this artificial kind of way. Of like, here's a relatable message, or here's a story I'm going to tell you. And I always felt like my experience of life was way more chaotic and visceral and emotional. With that in mind, here's Roland.
He carries
So if you were following, his best friend's a butcher from Poland, and he has a beard. Interpol received some criticism early on for their lyrics. I think to many, they can feel a little meaningless or even sloppy. But as you know, it can sometimes take a lot more effort to make something appear effortless. A defining element of Interpol's sound isn't just their seemingly offhand lyrics, but the distinctive way they're delivered. Many of their songs reveal a striking contrast, and it's especially evident in Roland, where Paul's heartfelt and earnest vocal delivery stands in sharp contrast to the often funny, ironic nature of the lyrics. You wouldn't expect someone to belt out lines like, he has a beard, or, oh look, it stopped snowing, with such solemn intensity. But Paul does, and in doing so, he elevates those seemingly mundane phrases into something more grandiose. In a way, this mirrors the ethos of the band itself. From the beginning, Interpol demanded to be taken seriously. Their uniform of black suits and ties wasn't just for show. As Paul once put it, we take the look seriously, and I think every band should. To phone in any facet of the artistic idea is contrary to my overall philosophy. Following the somber tone of Precipitate, Roland arrives as a much-needed burst of energy and playful relief. And we get yet another outro. If you're keeping score, we're 3 for 3 on instrumental outros so far. The closing track of the EP, 5, also known as Get the Girls, is a bold showcase of Interpol's instrumental prowess. The title likely refers to its place in the sequence of the band's earliest compositions. What sets this track apart is that it features one of only 2 vocal contributions from bassist Carlos Dengler, the other being very briefly in Song 7. The unpolished Get the Girls scream opening injects a visceral, almost startling energy. It would be hard to place a clear emotion on the scream. Perhaps frenzied would be the right word. Musically, it revolves around a rhythmic, cyclical interplay between guitar and bass, each line tightly woven into the track's driving momentum. This layered, interlocking texture is emblematic of Interpol's early, polyphonic approach to songwriting. Thanks to its lo-fi origin, demo status, and scarcity on mainstream platforms, this track resonates with dedicated fans as a deep-cut gem. By the end of 2001, Interpol had successfully crafted an identity. From their distinct aesthetic to their cinematic sound, they stood apart from their New York peers, carving a space that felt both classic and entirely their own. But despite the groundwork they had laid, from demo tapes to Peel sessions, they were still unsigned. That changed in 2002, when Matador Records took notice, and with that came a new chapter. They released a modest but impactful self-titled EP, and just months later, a debut album that would cast a long shadow over the indie rock landscape for years to come. We'll cover all that and more on our next episode of Interpolated. Thanks for listening. The incidental music for this episode was provided by Salt City, my own musical side project, and it's available on all streaming platforms. This has been a Griffin Studios podcast.